Welcome everyone to A City Built on Ships, a lecture with Dr. Chris Dostal from Texas A&M University and with Dr. Eleanor Breen from our very own Alexandria Archaeology. My name is Emma Richardson and I am the museum educator for Alexandria Archaeology. So tonight's program is the final event in this year's celebration of Virginia Archaeology Month. So before we begin, I'd like to thank any of the Friends of Alexandria Archaeology members for joining us tonight. If you enjoy the program, please consider becoming a member by clicking on the link that I'm adding to the chat right now. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Alexandria Archaeological Commission members here tonight as well. You can support our work by donating to Alexandria Archaeology with the second link that I just added to the chat. So if you have any questions for our speakers tonight, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there. The chat function won't work this evening, so use that Q&A function. We'll be answering any of your questions at the end of the presentation. And if we don't get to everybody's questions, we will get to you separately. We'll email you after the lecture tonight. So we'll be recording tonight's lecture and we'll share that on our YouTube page, the Alexandria Archaeology YouTube page, for any of you who could not attend tonight. But don't worry, your video and audio are off, so your own participation won't be shared publicly. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Eleanor Breen. Eleanor is the city archaeologist for Alexandria, and she is going to provide a brief introduction to Alexandria's recently discovered maritime history before introducing our main speaker for the evening.
Thank you so much, Emma. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Well, I'm really glad to be here tonight to give just a brief introduction on the Alexandria Ships Project. And I want to say before I get started that it was really nice to see so many familiar names registering for this event tonight. Lots of friends of Alexandria Archaeology, volunteers and supporters of our museum and our program, and also, of course, of this SHIPS project, which we couldn't have done without such robust community support. So thank you, and hope you enjoy the talk tonight. So I'm going to just give a little bit of a broad overview on the archaeology, the waterfront archaeology in Alexandria from river to pond, just to give you a little bit of context for the amazing presentation that Dr. Dostal has prepared for this evening. As many of you know, Alexandria Archaeology is a city archaeology program. We study and share Alexandria's heritage in our museum on the 3rd floor of the Factory. And we do that with the support of our Friends group and also with the Alexandria Archaeological Commission, which is the oldest commission of its kind in the country. A lot of the work we do has to do with our unique archaeological protection code that allows us to partner with developers and other partners in the city to steward Alexandria's history in many different ways. And we'll see an example of that tonight with the waterfront archaeology. So there's been a lot of activity along the Potomac River shoreline in Old Town Alexandria over the past 10 years or so. There's been new developments coming into existence and new ways that people are using pedestrian spaces. And we're beginning to see renewed interest in Alexandria's seaport history and see many of the different ways that that history is infused into the changing waterfront with new temporary public art installations, with a new African-American heritage trail, and with a new historic interpretation that we see in some of the development that draws from the archaeological work that's happened since 2015. What I want you to see in this slide is a map that's drawn of Alexandria's shoreline in 1748. That's the backdrop for the map. The gray streets that you see are the modern street grid in Alexandria, and the black line shows the modern shoreline of Old Town today. And what I'd like you to focus on here is the 2 archaeological sites at the foot of Duke Street. that yielded such a wealth of archaeological information. One of those is the Hotel Indigo site, which you'll be hearing more about tonight. And the other, just on the south side of that, is the Robinson Landing site. And these two sites you'll see from the map straddle the original topography, the original ground of Alexandria's shoreline, but they also straddle into the mudflats of the Potomac River. And just by a brief glimpse at this map, you can see just how much land was created in the 1780s and 1790s to build to that deeper channel of the Potomac River. The land making activities made 10 city blocks that didn't previously exist. And involved the labor of enslaved people and white indentured servants. On this slide, I would like you to focus on these 4 red blobs that you see on the map here. Those are the evidence that archaeologists found of this land making activity, which included wharves and warehouses built upon them, but also the reuse of derelict ship hull remnants. And in fact, archaeologists found 4 ship hull remnants within 2 city blocks as they were digging doing their excavations before the construction of the new development sites. So the one on the north end here is where the Hotel Indigo currently stands, and the 3 on the south end are where the Robinson Landing site stands. And so these 4 ships and the city that was built on top of them really gave us a much greater understanding of Alexandria's maritime heritage. And in fact, you can see in this slide here how the ship that was found at Robinson Landing is literally forming that early land-making structure. There's a wharf built on top of it, and there's a warehouse built on top of that. The first ship that was found at the Hotel Indigo site was dismantled piece by piece and stored in tanks of water until a decision was made about what the next steps would be. That's because as soon as that waterlogged wood hits the air, it begins to dry out and to decompose. And so it was critical that the archaeologists worked quickly to remove the ship and put it in tanks of water for future study. And in fact, the city contracted with Texas A&M University to conserve the timbers from that ship so that they will be able to become reconstructed and put on exhibit in a future museum. So what you see here is city archaeologist Ben Skolnick looking into the tanks of water where the ship timbers sit. They're going through a chemical process that will slowly replace the water in the cellular structures of the wood with a wax substance called polyethylene glycol. And those timbers will then be put into, I think, the largest freeze dryer in the world to undertake that remaining conservation process, and then put back together and put on exhibit in a to be determined location. And here's some inspirations of what those exhibitions look like. The other 3 ships that were found in 2018 at the Robinson Landing site are now safely stored at the bottom of Ben Brenman Pond, a popular city park off of Duke Street in Alexandria. This creative conservation or preservation step will allow the future opportunity for study of these timbers and possibly eventual conservation. But right now they're being stored in the pond to keep them stable in water as close to their original burial environment as we can possibly get them. And at this stage, now that the timbers are on their preservation journeys, the city is undertaking a waterfront museum feasibility study. So this is an idea that originated in the planning of Alexandria's new waterfront, the potential location for a new history center that may incorporate the ship, the reconstructed ship, for exhibition. And so that is currently the broad overview of where the ships are. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Christopher Dostal. Hi. Hi. Dr. Chris Dostal is an assistant professor with the Department of Anthropology's Nautical Archaeology program at Texas A&M University. He's also the director of the Center for Maritime Archaeology and Conservation and the Conservation Research Laboratory. And most notably to us, He's the director of the Analytical Archaeological Laboratory, in charge of scanning the 4 18th century ships, 3D scanning the 4 18th century ships excavated in Alexandria. He holds degrees from Texas A&M University and the University of Colorado at Boulder, and his research includes historical maritime archaeology of North America and Western Europe, the conservation and long-term preservation of waterlogged archaeological artifacts, and the preservation and documentation techniques for underwater archaeological sites, X-ray fluorescence elemental analysis of archaeological artifacts, and digital imaging and 3D modeling of archaeological artifacts. And you can see some of the product of his work there on the right-hand side of the slide. I do just want to say before I turn it over to Dr. Dostal that we've really appreciated working with Chris and his colleagues and his students at Texas A&M. Their expertise and their dedication to preserving maritime heritage is really unparalleled, and we're really excited to get to share all of that with you tonight. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Well, thank you. What an intro. There we go. So good evening. I'm extremely grateful to both Emma and Eleanor for inviting me to do this. Really excited to be here with everybody. And I will start by answering, I think, probably the most common question I get when I tell people that I work at the Conservation Research Laboratory at Texas A&M is, why are you in Central Texas? You're nowhere near the water. In 1976, the person that's widely regarded as the father of nautical archaeology came to Texas A&M with his Institute of Nautical Archaeology and founded a degree granting program called the Nautical Archaeology Program. And 2 years after that, they started a laboratory with Dr. Donnie Hamilton called the Conservation Research Laboratory to start working on the materials that came from underwater excavations. So unlike normal terrestrial archaeology, the material that's underwater will, as Eleanor mentioned, very quickly start to degrade if it's not conserved. And so Dr. Bass knew that for us to have a successful nautical archaeology program, we'd have to have a successful conservation program as well. So the CRL is the largest and oldest continuously operating lab that specializes in waterlogged materials in the world, or in the country, probably not in the world. The lab itself got really built up in the mid-90s with the discovery and conservation of a 17th century French shipwreck, La Belle, which is here. And you can see this is La Belle on display at the State Capitol History Museum in Austin. In the last 23 years, we've done 203 conservation projects with over 2 million artifacts ranging in size from 12,000 pound anchors to just little beads. So that's why we're here. It's Dr. Bass came here. And that's why your ship is here. So a quick plug for the lab here, just kind of what we can and do. We are specialized in archaeological metals. We've conserved over 40 cannon in the last 6 years, and we're gearing up to do another 17 in the next 3. We have the world's largest archaeological freeze dryer. I'm sure there's larger freeze dryers for other things, but we also do, we have a photography studio, X-ray radiography studio. We do elemental analysis, laser scanning, computer modeling, 3D printing and modeling, and artifact molding and casting. But so that's why I'm talking to you from Texas today. And so let's talk about these ships. So to start, we're going to go back to 2015, 2016 with the discovery of the ship at the Hotel Indigo, which is feature 53, but our shorthand at the lab is always just to call it the Indigo ship. So apologies if I slip up and call it the wrong thing here. There's a long tradition of shipwrecks being named for the location that were found, where they are found rather. And so we just kind of rolled with that. So as Eleanor mentioned, this ship was discovered when they were excavating to build a hotel. And based on the kind of progression of that shoreline as it was extending out, it was deposited sometime between 1748 and 98. So after the ship was excavated, all the timbers were transferred to a city facility and submerged in some vats filled with fresh water. So as you saw in the previous picture, it looked like the timbers were buried in ground, and that's true, but because they're below the water line, they were effectively buried wet. And there's a process that water does called hydrolysis, which starts to break down the material in the cellular structure of the wood. And if you've ever had to soak a pan after like baking lasagna or something like that, you know that water will slowly break things down. And so it was integral to keep the shape of the timbers that they were kept wet. In fact, some of the bigger timbers that didn't fit in the big roll-off containers that they have here were kept under plastic sheets and hosed down periodically to keep them wet. So the reason for this is because of the cellular makeup of the wood. If we look inside wood cells, there's three primary constituent components. You have cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And over time, the water starts to break the sugars down, specifically the cellulose and the hemicelluloses, and they get leached out. And when they're gone, the thing that takes their place is more water. So through time, the water is actually what's holding the shape of the cells together. And if you don't take that water out safely and stabilize the cells, it'll collapse pretty spectacularly. And here's an example. The piece on the left of your screen here and the piece on your right of the screen here are both cut from the same log. This was a 17th century piece of wood from Port Royal, Jamaica that we did some tests on. The sample on the right was stuck in the window to dry, just as you dry anything normally, and the sample on the left was run through a freeze dryer. And as you can see, there's a pretty sizable difference here. And the reason for that is water is very, very sticky. We don't really think of it that way very often, but if you toss a glass of water onto the wall, what do you think is going to happen? Obviously, you get thrown out of that Denny's, but it sticks to the wall. If you throw a glass of marbles at the wall, they'll bounce off. And so when wood is drying, just as it would naturally in the air, the water is drawn through those cells, and because it sticks to everything, it collapses the cells around them. We can circumvent this by a process called freeze drying, where the timbers are all frozen and then a strong vacuum is pulled on it, and the ice actually sublimates directly to a vapor, meaning it skips the liquid phase of water, and that's where it's sticky. So freeze drying was not developed for archaeology. You've probably come across lots of freeze-dried foods in your life, even if you didn't realize it. MREs, astronaut ice cream, the marshmallows and Lucky Charms, these are all freeze-dried foods. And so, yeah, we have the world's largest archaeological freeze dryer. And you can see these are timbers that were freeze-dried from LaBelle that came out, and then we put them back together at the museum. And this is exactly the process that we're doing with the ship that was found underneath the Indigo Hotel. If you ever are in Austin, I highly recommend swinging by the Bob Bullock State History Museum. This is a really cool display. So the freeze dryer is pretty big. We thought it would be easier to come get the timbers than bring the freeze dryer there. So we came to Alexandria and prepared all the timbers for shipment. Now, you can't just take these big containers and throw them on the back of a truck and ship it with in water, because every time a truck breaks, the water would slosh and it would break up the wood on the inside. So instead, what we did is took the timbers out, wrapped them in wet paper towels here, and then wrapped them in plastic wrap, and then wrap them on the outside in foam so that they would be kind of in a little watertight but safe encapsulated space. And then everything was loaded up onto a truck. You can see all of the timbers being prepped here, and you can see a few that are still being wrapped over here. There was a big open house that was the occasion of the photo here. So everything was trucked here to the conservation lab. The boxes have the smaller timbers packed with straw, and then the larger timbers were underneath that tarp there. And so we used the forklift to get everything out. Everything was unwrapped and re-tagged We like to use these little dymo. Oh my God, I don't know what happened there. Dymo labelers, because the tags that were initially given when they were excavated are paper with Sharpie on it. And our lab is, most of it's outdoors. And so in the Texas sun, the Sharpie gets obliterated. So we do these little imprint tags to keep the shape of it. So everything was unwrapped, tagged, and then put back into water vats. And then some of the timbers, we needed forklifts because they're so big. But that's everything unpacked. And so from there, as Eleanor said, the timbers are currently going through chemical treatment. And what we're doing is we're adding that synthetic wax polyethylene glycol. You've probably come across polyethylene glycol in your life too. It's what Miralax is. So if you ever get blocked up, polyethylene glycol does the trick. So polyethylene glycol does two things for us. As we allow it to soak into the wood, it coats the cells and provides a little bit of rigidity. And it also helps form smaller ice crystals when we freeze the timbers to be freeze dried. One of the things that we've been doing as well is polyethylene glycol reacts poorly with iron over time. And so we've been chemically treating the timbers to pull the iron out. If you don't do that, in about 15-20 years, there'd be acid propagation on the surface of the wood. So the conservation process is very long, and it prevents us spending much time with the timbers to study the vessel. And so to get around that, we laser scanned all of the individual timbers so we could study it. And laser scanning is a way to take millions and millions of tiny little measurements and put them all together to give us highly detailed 3D models. So here's a zoom in, you can see all those little points. And as the laser scanner works, it knows the location of all those points in 3D space. And so as you pull out, you can actually see the real object. It's not unlike a Seurat painting or the pointillism. So we take all of the timbers, lay them on a table, scan one side, flip them over, scan the other side, and then we'd have to align the two scans to make a good model. That's what you can see here. These little points you find the same spot on both scans, and it helps align it to make a whole timber. And we were very happy with the result of this. The detail that you can see on the screen here is really, really good. You can see the swirl marks from the saw used to cut these in the field. You can see some of the shipworm damage to the false keel. You can see all the grains, and it gave us a lot of good information, and it kept all the detail that allowed us to put the ship back together virtually. So to do that, the first thing that we needed to do was to reassemble the backbone of the ship, called the keel. So the keel was cut actually in 3 places in the field that you can see here. And so what we did is we tracked down the make and model of the chainsaw that was used so that we could find out the thickness of the chain, and then create these little gaps so that the keel wouldn't be artificially short. This is a 3/8 inch spacers there between the sections. And then we also lined up the apron and the stem here. And what we did is using the impressions of the trunnels, the fasteners, excuse me, that were used to connect these pieces, we created virtual drift bolts and used those to align everything to make sure that it was aligned correctly. One of the things that we're wanting to do when we do this is to reassemble the ship, not exactly the way it was found in the ground, but we want to reassemble it more in line with the way that it would have been sailing. So most sailing ships don't work well if you cut them in half. And so we were trying to account for any deformation that occurred when it was getting that second use as a wharf or whatever it was. But one of the other things we did is occasionally we would take an X-ray of timbers just to verify that the directionality of the bolts that we were estimating were dead on, and they were always correct. So we were very confident about the placement. Once the keel was set, the next thing to do is to put in the frames or the ribs of the ship. The way that we did that was, depending on the location of the frame, we could either match up the bolt that was in the frame to the to the corresponding bolt location on the keel. But what was done when the ship was buried, before the ship was buried rather, was someone came through and cut the wrong button there. Oh God, what just happened? Spoilers. Okay, someone came through and they cut the floor timbers, that's the bottommost timber that crosses the keel, away from the keel, and then they did this starting from the aft end of the ship, and then as they moved forward, you can see that the weight that was on the remaining floor timbers up top was so much that it just snapped these ones. So to place the timbers in the bow of the ship were relatively straightforward, but as we moved aft, we kind of had to just rely on the location of the bolts on the keel and then an estimation of where it would be. And then we went through and refined it later once we put the planks down. We also had a lovely reference of, there was a 3D model, a photogrammetric model that was created by the US Navy's Heritage or History and Heritage Command's underwater branch. Some of their archaeologists came and helped document that, and that was very useful to us. So once the floor timbers down, the very bottom timbers of the ship were in place, we could come in and put the next timber up, which is called a futtock. And so futtocks are part of the frame, but they don't cross the keel. Sometimes they come all the way down to the keel, but in this case, they're not quite, there's a fair bit of space here. And they continue the shape of the frame up towards what was left of the ship. And we use the same methodology for that. And then we also put in the second futtocks. And that's all we had for the structure, the framing structure of the ship. And so from there, we used the trunnel marks to place the planks. And I have a little quick video here just to show you what a trunnel is. It's a tree nail. It's a British thing. Oh, there we are. So they drill through the plank and the frame, then take a large wooden peg and then just bash it into place. And the nice thing about building a ship with a trunnel is that when the wood gets in the water, those trunnels swell up and they create a really, really watertight joint. So what we did is we actually created virtual trunnels, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, that matched the orientation going in, coming out of the framing timbers, and use those to align the planks, because the laser scanning was precise enough that we had all of that data still. You can see all of the trunnel holes in the plank runs, and you can see that there's a little bit of gaps between the planks. Now, this obviously is not the way it would have been when it sailed, but because of the long deformation that occurred as it was used for its second use, we could only stretch them so far based on the laser scan data. So we didn't want to take too many leaps here, but you wouldn't be able to see daylight through the hull of the ship generally. And then there it is with the frames in place. So, oh, and I want to give you just you can see the detail of the laser scans, all of the little grains of wood and everything. We got a lot of detail. So now that we had a virtual copy of the timbers assembled to look the way they were, the next step was for us to try and figure out what that ship looked like when it sailed. So the goal was to develop what's called a set of ship's lines drawings, and it's effectively just a blueprint for a boat, and it conveys the 3D data of a boat in a 2D format. It's what a shipwright would have used to design the boat. So if you think about the way that we tend to interact with boats, we see them from the water line up. So if you want to identify a boat, you'd look at the way the hull looks, you'd look at the way the masts look and the rigging. But with this ship, the Indigo ship, we have everything from the water line down. So the way that we can figure out what the boat looked like is a lot more complicated than it would be just out sailing. So what we did is we took the 3D model and kind of pulled a series of lines based on the curvature of the framing timbers. And then we came up with a very kind of paltry set of partial lines. Now, there aren't a ton of archaeological examples of ships from this period, but there's a fair amount of documentary examples of ships from this period. And so then we just went through and based on the size of the timbers, based on the framing pattern and the lines that we pulled off this 3D model, we compared it to other ships that could be a similar match. And then we developed our own set of lines for what we think the ship could have looked like. And that's this here. So we also wanted to have a more physical way to show this ship and digital data. And so we turned to 3D printing. So we 3D printed all of the timbers at a 1:12 scale. The framing timbers were all printed with a rigid plastic called PLA. And then the planking timbers were printed in a flexible material, which they called Ninja Flex. So it's tough to take the whole process very seriously when the word ninja is attached. But the more flexible rubbery material allows us to print these at scale and still have them conform to the shape of the hull. And as you can see, they print with the trunnel holes empty. And so, you know, as they printed out, we would line them up and get ready. And then our model maker, Glenn Gryko, who's a master ship model maker, used a printed out plan of the 3D model, the virtual model, and used that to assemble the timbers physically. And what he did is use a series of thin wooden sticks called battens to attach to different points of the ship to create a natural wooden curve that we could then use to there was an iterative process between the physical modeling and the digital modeling where he'd tighten something up, so we'd have to go back and tighten it up in the digital model. In fact, to plank the ship, he simply located the trunnel holes on the framing timbers and lined them up with the trunnel holes on the printed planks, and then used little dowels to reattach the planks exactly they would have been at full scale. But what we end up with here is, you can see, it looks a lot like the ship that was found under the Indigo Hotel, but it doesn't exactly inspire a recognition of a seaworthy vessel. So we knew that we wanted to create some kind of a way to frame this remnant in the rest of what the ship would have looked like. So we took that set of plans that we used and made wire frame sections so that it would contextualize the ship. And we only have the forward 2/3 of the ship. And so we had to extend the keel out a little bit. And you can see that here, and then build up a transom. And we also finished going up for the bow and set the deck level. So here's the final model once it was all painted and fancy. And you can go see this at the museum in the city. So the reconstructed vessel dimensions that we came up with was a ship that was about 70 feet long. The keel would have been about 58 feet long. The maximum beam was about 18.5 feet. And so it's a decent sized ship, but nothing massive. And but this way, when you go see it, I don't know how I keep doing it. You can see the context, I think, makes all the difference in the world. So then, as Eleanor mentioned, they found some more ships. And so this is a drawing that was made by the city archaeologists. Here's our Indigo ship, and here's the other three. But as she mentioned, the city and the citizens of the city stepped up and put forth a lot of money to conserve that Indigo ship. But the prospect of conserving three more, I think, was a little bit beyond the pale. So they excavated all of the ships and brought them back to that same city facility, but this time they had above ground pools instead of dumpsters that you have to rent. and stored all the ships. And then we came with laser scanners to document all the ships the same way we had for the Indigo ship, with the intention of once we were finished with that the timbers would be reburied. So this started in late 2019. You can probably guess where this is going. The timbers were pulled from their vats, they were photographed, and the scanning of a timber isn't a particularly difficult process, but if you've ever seen like an old Kung Fu movie where they make the young Padawan hold a bucket of water out like this, it might not be heavy initially, but after a long time, it starts to really wear on you. And so we had, this is Julia Herbst and Carolyn Kennedy. They were our main scanning team. All the timbers were photographed and laser scanned, and then we do this for about 11 hours a day for a week straight for each trip, get through as many as possible, and then everyone go home and process the data and go to rehab to try and heal up in order to go back and scan more timbers. The nice thing about doing any kind of an archaeological project in a city like Alexandria is that there were a lot of people that came and volunteered their time to help out. Although you can only whitewash this fence so many ways before people realize that it's not the most exciting task. So our final trip to the city was scheduled for March of 2020 to finish the scanning, but some guy ate a bat. And so everything was completely shut down, and we did get special dispensation from the university to come in October. Here we are, to finish the scanning. So you can see the process here in this little micro machine speed. Basically, you're just kind of painting the timber with the laser scanner to build up those data points. But so we finished everything on that trip and then came back and processed everything. So I'm not gonna necessarily go through the gory details of how we processed it and how we built those models again, but I do want to show you the final product. So feature 155 was the first ship that was finished being scanned, and so subsequently it was the first one we processed and reassembled. The length in the ground was 50 feet long and 12 feet wide. And based on the location on the shoreline, it was deposited sometime between 1798 and 1845. Now, this is not a date attributed to the ship itself. It's just when it was buried, because we know that there has to be a shore to exist for it to be buried there. And here is the finished digital model. I was really pleased with this one. We have both ends of it, which is nice. And there's a lot of weird little construction features in here, including some gnarly bits up here that we're studying and plan on publishing soon. And then same deal, we did created a set of lines based on the shape of the hull, and then came up with a plausible reconstruction. So the reconstructed length is 58.5 feet long with a breadth of 19.5 feet and a depth of hole of about 14 feet. And we did the same thing again. We 3D printed. And so same exact process. We printed the timbers, Glenn assembled them all, and then used the set of lines to come up with this wireframe for interpretation. And the 3D print actually contains a lot of really great detail. And after we painted it, it's not nearly as, I think it looks pretty good, but you can see some of these little construction details in here. You can see the trunnel holes and all. I was pretty happy with the process, I guess. The next one here, this is feature 159. This is the largest of the four ships. It was 80 feet long in the ground, but more remains buried. So of the four ships, 3 of them were cut in half before they were used, or for their use rather, as piers or wharves or jetties or whatever they were used for. And of the four, this is the only one that was not cut in half. But this is, I believe, Wolf Street. And then this is some other thing back here that nobody had permission to dig through. So of the four ships, the only one that wasn't cut in half in antiquity was cut in half in modern times, because that was the only way to get it out. So all the ships look consistently cut in half, but there's still more buried back here that maybe we can learn someday. I'm sure people are going to keep building things on the waterfront. So, based on the shoreline, this one was also probably deposited between 1798 and 1845. Here is the reconstruction of this. Because it's a much larger vessel, this was probably the most complex of the four ships to put together virtually. And we had to do a lot of back and forth between the physical model and this to come up with plausible ways that the wood would go, because the keel stops around here and the rest of the timbers, they go pretty far up, but we didn't have a baseline reference. So we had to get creative to figure that out. And here's the interpretive frame around it. Reconstructed length for this is 102.5 feet. And it's a maximum beam of about 25 feet with a depth of hold about 21 feet. So it's a nice sized boat. And here's the model. So you can see down here, the reconstructed keel here. And so there was a whole series of those thin wooden strips that we had to use to create a platform by which to lay these timbers there and fix them in before we planked it. So that's that. And then finally, feature 200, which like the Indigo ship, or feature 53 from that site, this was deposited between 1748 and 98. Of the four ships, I have to admit, I like this one the best. It's really finely made. Someone took a lot of care to make sure that all of the frames were really cleanly cut and square. And then at some point later in its life, someone slapped another what's 8 or 9 inches of keel on the bottom of it. So I have this kind of little story in my head about this really nicely built boat that got past its usable life and then sold to somebody else, and they stuck a bunch of keel on it so they could throw some more sail on it and get a faster ship and just run it into the ground. But this was obviously also cut in half. What remained was 50 feet and with about 12 feet wide. And here is the digital reconstruction. You can just see it's so precise. I really like this one. And this had a very strange shape to it. We kind of reconstructed it almost double-ended, not quite, but almost double-ended, but with no transom. And this is because the lines that we came up with pulled from the vessel really matched a couple of types of vessels that would have had this kind of a shape, but the no transom there. So reconstructed length is 47 feet. The maximum breadth is 14 feet, and the depth is only about 6.5 feet. It's a much smaller ship, not much smaller, but small enough. And so here's what the model looked like for that. Just a really pretty little vessel. So the models were delivered to the museum at the end of March of 2022, so just a few months back. So you can see here's the big guy, here's 155, and here is 200 up in the, I think it's called Mom's Attic. And we couldn't really figure out a good way to ship these, and so we bolted them to the floor of, or the bottom of a U-Haul truck and just drove them up. And this is Glenn again. So of those 3 new ships, here they are in their glorious 3D-ness. And putting them together like this, I think, really helps contextualize how big the 159 is. And remember, we don't have all of it here, so this isn't the reconstruction. This is just the remnant fragments. And then if we add Indigo to the mix, here we are. So we are continuing to study these hulls still, even though the models are delivered and the timbers are reburied. because before this project, there really aren't that many, just a handful of archaeological examples of ships from this period. So like I said, we have documentary evidence, but documentary evidence is always going to be an idealized version of the ship. And so getting to study these physical remains allows us to see the kind of shortcuts or tricks of the trade that were being used. We can, these are really good references for us to track the progression of ship technology. This kind of mid to late 18th century, early 19th century period is a really dynamic period for sail. And so this is, it's been an absolute thrill to be able to study these. Yeah, we'll continue to study them. They're going to be an amazing reference. I like that through no fault of their own, the city archaeologists like Eleanor and Emma and everybody else became some of the preeminent nautical archaeologists in the world, because they've disassembled and studied more ships than a lot of people ever get a chance to do, even if this is your field of study. So with that, I want to say thank you. A big thank you to the city of Alexandria, and then all of our credits and whatnot. And I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, you're muted, Eleanor.
There we go. Thank you so much for that, that really incredible PowerPoint and very detailed way to talk us through the process. And I'll say, you know, we have not become the preeminent maritime archaeologists. I learn something every time that the archaeologists in Alexandria talk with the all the amazing staff at the CRL. So we're still learning. Degrees are in process. So
you guys know a lot more than most, I'll tell you.
Okay, so I'm gonna just turn over to the Q&A right now. And the first question for you is from Al Cox, who asked, what did they do with the other halves of the ships? Wouldn't you expect them to be buried closely nearby? I think that's a really good question. You know, I'll speak to that a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to you for what your theory might be. You know, I think that what the underwater archaeologist Ben Ford has found is that oftentimes these pieces of vernacular architecture that are used as landmaking are kind of cut to manageable size, about 50 feet long or so. These medium-sized vessels seem to be or when they're cut down, a manageable size to use as wharf architecture or land-making structures. I think we've seen in some newspaper accounts that some of these ships are being cut and used as firewood. So, you know, there's some reuse going on in that way. So perhaps maybe the other halves aren't right next to it. I don't know, do you have any theories?
Very similar to yours. My thought was that they were trying to get to a portion of the ship that's flat enough to be useful for what they needed it for, and that bottom of the ship tends to be it. You wouldn't want to go, as you could see in 200 and 155, I can just go back here a second. They're pretty flat ships overall, but 53 here probably tucked up a bunch when it got towards the stern, and so it wouldn't have been a very desirable section to use for what they were using it for. And then, yeah, we've seen lots and lots of examples of ships being used as firewood. Sometimes ships were burned just for entertainment. If there's usable planks, you take those and make repairs of your house or build a shed, or, you know, whoever kind of had dibs to it would be able to use all sorts of the items that were on these ships.
Great. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what we know about the origin of the ships, where they were made, and what might be the evidence that we would need to know more about the origin.
Well, unless you are privy to information I haven't seen yet, I don't think we really know all that well exactly where they're from.
Right.
There's a couple issues at hand. One, as I mentioned, I think one of the best ways to tell where a ship was built is to study the wood. And that is a process called dendrochronology, and these have proven to be pretty difficult ships to use dendrochronology for. And a big part of that reason is because there are so few other examples. And the other thing is that if these are British or, I mean, they're British either way, I suppose, at the time, but if they're British or American built, the traditions between the two aren't going to be terribly different at this time. Based on the size of the timbers and how close all of the frames are together, my gut would be to suggest that they're probably all built in North America, because the Brits had really worn down their tree supply. And when everybody came to North America, they were giddy with how much lumber was available. And you can see it doesn't matter what these ships are used for. Unless it's a war, there's no real reason to have the framing that tight. 200 is a much better, like a more reasonable design, but even that's quite tight. Other ships, especially from Europe, would have a much more a lot more space between the frames.
Yeah, and we've done some research into the ship news, the comings and goings of ships in and out of Alexandria's port, and that matches up with your hypothesis of these being North American manufacture, because Alexandria's trade during the time when these ships went into the ground is mostly up and down the mid-Atlantic, ports like Boston and Philadelphia. And the dendrochronology was successful on the one ship from the Hotel Indigo site, and suggesting that that was at least made from timber harvested near the Boston, Massachusetts area. So again, no absolute answers, but certainly evidence pointing in that direction.
Yeah, these would have been like just the big rigs of the day.
How did you decide what the rest of the shape of the ship looked like for the models?
Well, so as I had said, we pulled the as much shape as we could off of what existed in the timbers, and then luckily there's only so many ways to build a ship, and so based on those projections, there's really only a handful of ways that the rest of it could go. And like we used contemporary vessels that we have historical records of, and lines that were drawn for them to try and come up with a plausible shape. So what we did is we came up with plausible shapes, but they are not definitive shapes. You could, I think with all of these, you could probably come up with a slightly different set of lines that would still fit what we have left. So we're really just trying to provide some context as to what the ship probably would have looked like or could have looked like. But it's, unless there's a lot more construction on the waterfront, we may never find out for sure.
Well, that's my favorite thing about those models, and the one on exhibit in our archaeology museum, is I think it really shows what archaeologists do, which is find a small fragment of the past and bring together historical documents and comparative information to sort of rebuild our best interpretation of what happened. But we don't know exactly what happened in history, but it's sort of through the combination of sources and the real tangible physical evidence that allows us to interpret history. So
yeah, it was very, that's the nice thing about being here is with the combined faculty and staff of the Nautical Archaeology program, there's just a lot of ship history obsessives around that you can ask, you know, oh, what does this look like to you? Oh, I've seen it such and such. So we just kind of knocked on everybody's door until we got enough information to make the guesses.
We have a couple questions about the use of the ships and sort of their name or their owner, and you know, I'll just start by saying we haven't been able to trace the exact names of these ships. They're not like naval ships that are decommissioned and have a record that's preserved. We have actually very little documentation about the land building process as well. So we don't have the names or the owners. It may be something that comes to light with additional research, but it is likely that we will never know the names of these ships. But that it is most likely that their primary use was as cargo ships or merchant ships. Isn't that correct, Chris?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of, if you went to, I guess it's not a good allegory, but these are kind of like old pickup trucks on bricks in someone's yard. It's a disused vessel, but it wouldn't occur to anybody to really make a big deal about the fact that these things are getting chopped up or buried, because they would already be on the next vessel sailing around. Most shipwrecks that are discovered never have a definitive name to them, and that's why we go with place names so often.
Mm-hmm. Our Archaeological Commission member, Ted Pulliam, asked if we have the dendrochronology results from the 3 Robinson landing ships, and we do have a report on that dendrochronology work. I think it's in our bibliography. If it hasn't been posted yet, it will be soon. But unfortunately, the dendrochronology wasn't successful. Even after repeated samples were taken from the other 3 ships, they weren't able to yield a match with existing data sets. So there's still a lot more to learn about these ships that wasn't yielded through the dendrochronology. Okay, this question is, why only the starboard halves of those ships preserved? Good question.
So, well, 159, we know why.
Yeah. Yeah. So 159, even though it looks like only the starboard half was preserved, in fact, that was the ship that was impacted by the construction at the Robinson Landing site. So the stern and the port are preserved in the ground, and only what was going to be impacted by construction inside the footprint was studied and dismantled and removed, and then 3D scanned by Texas A&M.
It's a great question. I don't have the slightest idea. Presumably the other halves are out there somewhere.
This is a good question about any preserved ships in Europe that may be similar, and is the ship design unique to America or replicated in Europe? You talked a little bit about that, but any similar examples in Europe?
There's a fair few in England and all throughout Western Europe for sure. Spanish ships have Spanish and Portuguese ships have a fairly distinct design differences. So this would most likely be more of a corollary to British ships. But again, there's really not that many ways that you build a ship. Shipbuilding tends to be a very conservative practice because you don't want to implement a new weird design and then it fail, because it's very expensive and you kill a lot of people. And so there's a very gradual progression of changes that occur throughout history in ship design. But we're at a point in the 18th century and early 19th century where things are relatively standardized. So while there are sort of similar ships elsewhere, ships of this period from North America, there's just not that many examples.
We had a question about related artifacts, for example, navigation instruments found during the excavation of the upper, of the fill of these ships. And I'll say that there were hundreds of thousands of artifacts found in the land that was made on top of these ships related to early Alexandrians living and working on the waterfront. So those artifacts, tend to be domestic in nature or associated with trades like baking or other trades that were taking place. Most of the fill of these ships wasn't sort of the cargo that the ships contained, because all of that was stripped out, but instead the fill that was pulled down from the steep banks of Alexandria's shoreline and pulled into the mudflats and filling in these ships. And so there were occasional artifacts found in the fill layers above the ships, but it's most likely that those were not associated with the use of the ship. Oh, okay, so this is a good one. Chris, is it possible to tell if a ship was used more for river versus ocean going?
Oh yeah, very much so. For river ships, for ships that are meant to navigate rivers, you want to have a much flatter bottom and a much kind of sturdier keel. because these are ships that are most likely going to be run aground intentionally. And also because rivers aren't that deep, so you really can't have like a sharply shaped hull that's going to cut deep because you get stuck all the time. You also, for a ship that's going to be on a river, the lateral resistance provided by the keel isn't that important because you don't have the same kind of currents and winds that you'd have out to sea. So when you have a ship being propelled by a sail out on the ocean, you have the keels cutting deep into the water to provide that lateral resistance to the water and help the wind push it forward. And so the term that we use is a sharper hull line. It's a sharper V-shaped hull with a bigger keel for ocean going.
Reading the ships is a big part of it. Okay, so the next question was about residue inside of the timbers that might suggest the cargo. I think we partially answered that question in so much as that these ships went through a lot of post-depositional processes that probably affected their ability to tell us more about what they were when they sailed. But that's a good question. And the next question was, how deep were these buried and how were they found? So the ships were fairly deeply buried below the surface of the ground, 15 to 30 feet. And they were found because archaeologists were monitoring the removal of soil by a backhoe. And that's often what we see in urban archaeology is the excavation of trenches and sort of the slow removal of fill by a trained backhoe operator. And they came across what they saw was, waterlogged wood and carefully then exposed the ships, and that's how they were discovered. And so using something like geophysical techniques or ground penetrating radar doesn't really work on such a deeply buried deposits like this, especially in urban environments where there are layers of the city between the person operating the GPR machine and the ship so deeply buried. So it really is through careful urban archaeology that they're found. And I think that's most of the questions in the Q&A. I just wanted to end with one. Chris, I was thinking when you talked, I wondered if you could just expand a little bit on how you've used this particular project to introduce graduate students or undergraduate students to the field of historical archaeology and underwater archaeology. Sort of how does Alexandria feature in your classes and your work with students?
Pretty heavily. There's two avenues here. One, we have the Hotel Indigo ship out at the lab that we're conserving. And so we always bring our students for tours around the lab. And there's a big difference between reading a textbook about an archaeological project that's occurred and seeing the physical object in front of you. And so the lab tours tend to flip a lot of majors. I'm sure much to the dismay of many, many parents, but beyond that, it's extremely unusual this day and age for ships to be discovered and then excavated. The UNESCO Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage urges what's called in situ preservation, which is you can dig a ship up and study it, but then you have to rebury it and leave it alone in case future generations want to look like it. And a big part of that is because it's so expensive and so technically complicated to conserve an object this size. These are big things. And so the knowledge that we've gained with the excavation of these 4 ships, I can't overstate it. There's only a handful of ships that are being excavated around the world, period, anymore. And so this is just leaps and bounds, giving us ideas, because you can record to a certain point, but a lot of it's guesses. And for us to be able to flip these things upside down and look at every little it's answering a lot of interesting questions. And so that tied with the type of historical research that you guys have done with the archaeology office for the city, it's kind of a perfect textbook case study to show how the archaeology marries with the historical research to fill in the gaps. And so this is a heavy component in all of the classes I teach and all the classes that Carolyn teaches, and it's starting to leak out into the other courses as well, just because it's such an unusual case. I will also say, just so everyone watching knows, because I don't know if it's obvious, but the city has an exceptional archaeology team. It's not that other cities don't have good archaeology teams. It's this that I haven't seen a city archaeology team that's quite as capable as you guys. And so it's been a pleasure for us to work with you and learn from you as well about the way that things are being handled. I don't have any concept of how you get so much done, but it's very impressive.
Through great partnerships and incredibly devoted volunteers, I think.
You guys have a great volunteer base. That's true.
Well, thank you so much for at least virtually coming to Alexandria tonight and talking about the project and your role and all that you have learned. And like Emma said in the chat, please follow up with us on email if you have additional questions or something sparks your mind. This week or this weekend, we're happy to answer additional questions, and we'll follow up with any questions that didn't get answered in chat or add a little bit more clarification to those. And wanted to thank everyone for their time this evening, and hope you'll join us at one of our future programs, whether those are virtual or in person in our museum or throughout the city. So thanks everyone for your time, and it was good to see you.
Thanks everyone.